The gunshot cracked through the quiet of the two-lane county road so suddenly that the birds nesting in the oak trees exploded into the sky at once, and Caleb Mercer stood frozen beside his pickup truck, staring at the man lying half in the gravel shoulder and half in the ditch, blood slowly spreading through the dirt as the smell of gunpowder hung in the humid Arkansas evening. Caleb's hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the revolver. For a long second he could not hear anything except the rushing roar in his own ears. The cicadas had stopped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Jesus," he whispered, staring at the body. The man had been yelling just a moment earlier, yelling and advancing. Now he wasn't moving at all. Caleb forced himself to breathe. The revolver felt heavy and alien in his hand, like it belonged to someone else. His boots crunched against the gravel as he took one slow step closer to the ditch. The headlights from his truck washed over the scene, throwing long shadows across the weeds. The man's face was turned partly away, but Caleb recognized him immediately. Daniel Rourke, deputy sheriff, and Caleb's brother-in-law. A wave of cold panic rolled through him so violently his knees almost gave out. "No, no, no," Caleb muttered. "This wasn't supposed to." His voice died in his throat. Daniel wasn't moving. The front of his deputy uniform was soaked dark with blood, spreading wider every second. Caleb crouched down instinctively, though every part of him wanted to run. He reached out with a trembling hand and pressed 2 fingers against Daniel's neck. Nothing. No pulse. Just the sticky warmth of blood. Caleb jerked his hand back as if burned. The silence of the rural highway felt unnatural now, suffocating. It was a back road outside of Ashford County, the kind where maybe one car passed every 15 minutes. Caleb's truck idled behind him, engine rumbling softly, its headlights illuminating the ditch like a stage. Everything suddenly felt too visible, too exposed. Caleb looked around wildly. Fields stretched out on both sides of the road, dark farmland fading into distant tree lines. No houses, no witnesses, just miles of quiet country road under a fading orange sky. "God," he breathed. "God, what did I do?" His mind tried to replay the last few minutes, but the memory came in fragments. Daniel stepping out of his cruiser. The flashing blue lights behind Caleb's truck. Daniel shouting something. Caleb shouting back. The revolver in Caleb's hand because Daniel had tried to grab him. And then the gun going off. He hadn't meant to pull the trigger. Or maybe he had. The thought twisted in his chest like a blade. A distant engine sound suddenly echoed faintly across the farmland. Caleb's head snapped up. Headlights appeared far down the road. Someone was coming. Panic surged through him so fast his vision blurred. If they saw him standing here with Daniel's body, his brother-in-law, a deputy sheriff, everything would be over before he even understood how it had happened. Prison. His sister Sarah, his mother, his whole life collapsing in one irreversible moment. Caleb staggered to his feet. The approaching headlights were still distant but getting closer. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe less. He looked down at Daniel again. The badge glinted in the truck's headlights. Caleb's stomach twisted violently. "I'm sorry," he whispered hoarsely, though he wasn't sure if he meant it for Daniel or himself. He grabbed Daniel under the arms and tried to drag him farther into the ditch. The body was heavier than Caleb expected. Dead weight in the most literal sense. Gravel scraped loudly as Caleb pulled him a few feet down the embankment, weeds brushing against Daniel's uniform. The headlights down the road were brighter now. Caleb's pulse pounded in his temples. He let go of the body and stumbled backward toward his truck. The revolver was still in his hand. He stared at it like it might explain what had just happened. Then instinct kicked in. He wiped the handle with the bottom of his shirt, not thinking clearly, just reacting. The approaching vehicle roared past seconds later, a pickup hauling cattle cages. The driver didn't slow down, didn't even glance toward the ditch. Caleb stood beside his own truck, chest heaving, watching the taillights disappear into the distance. He realized then that his entire body was trembling uncontrollably. The night air felt colder now. The sky had dimmed toward deep purple. Somewhere across the fields, a dog barked. Caleb looked down the slope again, at Daniel's body lying twisted in the weeds. Blood had soaked into the dirt beneath him. The reality of what had happened pressed down on Caleb like a physical weight. He had just killed a cop. Not just any cop. His sister's husband. A man who had eaten dinner at his mother's house every Sunday for the past 8 years. The smell of diesel and cut hay drifted across the fields. Caleb leaned against the truck door and pressed his forehead against the metal, eyes squeezed shut. "Think," he whispered to himself. "Just think." But his thoughts refused to organize. Images kept flashing through his mind. Sarah laughing at a barbecue last summer. Daniel fixing the fence behind Caleb's house 2 months ago. Daniel holding his newborn daughter at the hospital. Now Daniel was lying in a ditch because Caleb couldn't keep his temper under control for 10 seconds. A memory surfaced suddenly, sharp and unwanted. 15 minutes earlier. The argument on the side of the road. Daniel's voice hard and disappointed. "You've been running shipments for those guys again, haven't you?" Daniel had said, standing beside his cruiser. The blue lights flickered across his uniform. Caleb had looked away. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," Daniel snapped. "I've been covering for you for 2 years." 2 years, Caleb. You think I can't see what's happening? Caleb's jaw tightened. "I'm not discussing this here." Daniel stepped closer, voice dropping. "You're in deeper than you realize. Those people you're working with? They don't care about you. You're a mule to them." Caleb's chest tightened at the memory. Daniel had reached for the revolver on Caleb's hip then. "Give me the gun, Caleb." "Don't touch me," Caleb had warned. Daniel grabbed his wrist, and then everything had spiraled out of control. Back on the road now, Caleb opened his eyes slowly. The memory faded, leaving only the present horror. A sudden wave of dread rolled through him as another realization hit. Daniel's cruiser. Caleb looked down the road where the flashing lights had been earlier. The cruiser was still parked about 50 yards away, blue lights rotating lazily in the dark. Anyone driving by would see it. Someone would call it in eventually. The sheriff's department would be looking for Daniel soon. Caleb's breathing became shallow again. The timeline had already started. Dispatch would expect Daniel to check in. If he didn't, Caleb's gaze shifted back to the ditch, then to the cruiser, then to his truck. A terrible thought began forming, one that made his stomach twist but also felt like the only path forward. If Daniel had never stopped Caleb tonight, if the cruiser had never been here. Caleb straightened slowly. His mind was moving faster now, fueled by fear. He walked down to the ditch again and crouched beside Daniel's body. "You always said I'd screw my life up," Caleb muttered quietly. "Guess you were right." The badge on Daniel's chest glinted again in the headlights. Caleb hesitated for a long moment. Then he reached out and unclipped it. The metal felt cold in his palm. The distant hum of insects returned to the night as if nature had decided the moment of violence was over. Caleb stared at the badge, feeling a deep sickness settle in his gut. Somewhere far away, a siren wailed faintly across the county. Not close, but close enough to make his heart race again. Time was running out. Caleb shoved the badge into his pocket and stood up. His gaze moved toward the cruiser down the road. Blue lights still flashing, still waiting. "I didn't mean for this," he said under his breath. Then he started walking toward the cruiser, each step feeling heavier than the last. Unaware that 2 miles away in the small town of Ashford, inside a quiet diner near the highway exit, a woman named Lena Rourke had just looked up from her coffee as the police radio behind the counter crackled with a dispatcher's uneasy voice, asking why Deputy Daniel Rourke had suddenly stopped responding to calls. Lena Rourke had just looked up from her coffee as the police radio behind the counter crackled with a dispatcher's uneasy voice, asking why Deputy Daniel Rourke had suddenly stopped responding to calls. The whole diner seemed to tilt for a second, though nothing around her actually moved. A waitress named Connie, who had known Lena since high school, glanced toward the radio with mild curiosity and kept wiping down the pie case. 2 truckers near the window kept eating. The cook shouted for somebody to grab an order of fries. But Lena's body reacted before her mind did. Her fingers tightened around the coffee mug. "What'd she say?" she asked, though nobody had been talking to her. Connie turned, dish towel in hand. "Probably nothing. Radio acts up all the time." The dispatcher came back sharper now, trying again. "Unit 12, status check. Daniel, come back." Lena was already out of the booth. "Connie, can you turn that up?" Connie hesitated, then reached behind the counter and raised the volume. Static filled the air. Then another voice. Male, clipped and irritated. "Dispatch, I'm headed toward 12's last known. I got nothing on him." Lena's mouth went dry. Daniel was supposed to stop by the diner after his shift started. He had texted her at 6:30 and said, "Late tonight. Don't wait up. Kiss Emmy for me." It was a normal text. Boring, even. The kind of text people sent before the floor dropped out from under their lives. Connie saw Lena's face change and came around the counter fast. "Hey," she said quietly. "It's probably just his radio." Lena nodded automatically, but she was already reaching for her purse. "Yeah," she said, too quickly. "Yeah, sure." She took 2 steps toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "Can you call my mom if I don't come back? Emmy's over there." Connie blinked. "Lena, just do it." Then she pushed out into the night air, the diner bell jangling behind her. The parking lot smelled like rain on hot pavement and gasoline from the pumps next door. Lena's sedan was parked under the flickering sign. Her hands were shaking as she unlocked it. She got in, started the engine, and sat for 1 second with both hands gripping the wheel. Don't do this, she told herself. Don't go looking before you know anything. Wait for a call. Wait for someone official. But Daniel was family, and in Ashford County, family was the difference between sitting still and moving. She pulled out of the lot and headed toward the state highway. 10 minutes later, Caleb Mercer was wiping down the inside of Daniel's cruiser with a rag from the trunk, his movements jerky and incomplete, panic ruining every attempt at method. The flashing lights had started to feel like a spotlight on his back. He had dragged Daniel's body farther into the ditch, enough that a passing car might miss it in the dark unless headlights hit just right. It wasn't enough. None of it was enough. He had gone through Daniel's pockets with trembling fingers, taking the phone, the wallet, and the small spiral notepad Daniel always carried. Every second had felt like another nail sealing him into a box he had built himself. Now he stood beside the cruiser, staring at the steering wheel, trying to think like a different man. What would make this look like something other than what it was? An ambush? A disappearance? A roadside attack? His own reflection floated faintly in the cruiser window. Pale face, sweat on his forehead, eyes too wide. He barely looked human. He opened the driver's door and leaned in, smelling coffee, leather, and the faint chemical scent of Daniel's cologne. For a second, a flash of memory hit him so hard it stole his breath. 6 months earlier, Daniel sitting in this same cruiser outside Caleb's trailer, not in uniform that night, just exhausted, elbows on the wheel, saying, I know you think I'm trying to control you, but I'm trying to keep Sarah from burying another person she loves. Caleb had laughed then. Bitter, drunk, mean. You always talk like you're the only adult in the room. Daniel had looked at him with that infuriating sadness, not anger, and said, No, I talk like I know where this road goes. Back in the present, Caleb shut his eyes. Daniel had known. Maybe not the exact shape of it, but enough. Enough to stop him tonight. Enough to die for it. Caleb shoved the thought away and forced himself to act. He climbed into the cruiser and took a deep breath. The radio hissed softly. He grabbed the mic, then froze. Dispatch knew Daniel's voice. Anyone would. He said it back carefully. Sweat slid down the side of his face. Then he saw the gear shift. A new plan came, ugly and rushed. He could move the cruiser, send it into the creek bed half a mile up where the road curved near the old feed mill, maybe make it look abandoned after a struggle, maybe buy time. Time was everything. He put the cruiser in drive and eased it forward, headlights cutting through the dark. He drove with one hand and followed in his truck later, intending to come back. He told himself it was a plan. Really, it was terror wearing the clothes of strategy. At the same time, Sheriff Tom Bledsoe stood under fluorescent lights at the Ashford County substation. One thick hand braced on the dispatch desk, while a young dispatcher named Nikki kept trying Daniel's unit. Bledsoe was a wide man in his late 50s with a sun-beaten face and a permanent look of restrained disappointment, as if life had repeatedly failed to live up to minimum expectations. He respected Daniel, maybe liked him more than he liked most of his deputies. Daniel was steady, reliable, not flashy, not stupid. A man who finished what he started. The silence on the radio bothered him in a way he did not show. Where was his last stop? Bledsoe asked. Nikki checked her screen. Traffic stop on County Road 87. Registered to Caleb Mercer. Bledsoe's eyes narrowed slightly. Mercer. He knew the name. Everybody did. Construction jobs on and off. Fights in bars. One DUI that Daniel himself had talked a judge into going light on. Sarah Mercer's little brother. Bledsoe exhaled through his nose. Send McAvoy and Jenkins out there. I'm going too. Nikki nodded, and Bledsoe turned for the door just as Lena pushed into the station, her face pale and tight. Tell me what happened. Bledsoe stopped. In smaller counties, professionalism had to survive inside intimacy. He took off his hat. Lena, we don't know anything yet. Then why isn't he answering? She shot back. You tell me that. Bledsoe held her gaze. Could be radio trouble. Could be he got pulled into something. Daniel answers. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated herself for it. She straightened fast, chin lifting. I'm coming. No, you are not. Tom, no. He walked closer, lowering his voice. You know how this goes. Let us go look. Lena's eyes filled, but she refused to let tears fall. If you find him hurt, and I'm sitting at home waiting for a phone call, I'll never forgive you. Bledsoe stared at her for a beat, then rubbed a hand over his mouth. It was the wrong call, and he knew it. But Ashford was built on wrong calls made for human reasons. You stay in my vehicle, he said. You do not get out unless I tell you. Lena nodded before he finished. He didn't like that either. 20 minutes later, the convoy of patrol vehicles turned off the highway and onto County Road 87. Blue lights washed over the empty roadside, the fields, the sagging fences, the shallow ditch line. Lena sat rigid in the front passenger seat of the sheriff's SUV, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles hurt. She saw Caleb's truck first, parked crooked on the shoulder with the driver's door shut and the engine off. No Daniel, no cruiser. "Tom," she whispered. Bledsoe slowed. Deputy McAvoy stopped behind them and stepped out with a flashlight. The night had thickened, heavy and still. Bledsoe killed the siren but left the lights spinning. "Stay here," he told Lena. She already had her seatbelt off. "Lena, I'm not a child." Then she shoved her door open and got out. Gravel crunched under her sandals. Her heart hammered so hard it made her vision pulse. McAvoy swept his flashlight over the road, then down the embankment. "Sheriff." Something in his tone changed the air. Lena knew before she saw it. She knew with an animal certainty that split her cleanly in two. Bledsoe moved fast toward the ditch. Lena followed him despite his arm shooting out to block her. "Don't." She ducked past him. The flashlight beam found Daniel's hand first, caught in the weeds, wedding band glinting, then his shoulder, then his face, pale and slack under streaks of dirt and blood. Lena made a sound so raw it did not seem to come from a human throat. She slid down the embankment before anyone could stop her and dropped to her knees beside him. "Danny." Her hands went to his face, his shirt, his neck, as if there were still something left to check. "Danny, no, 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 baby. Come on." The blood had cooled. The skin under her hands was wrong, too still, too distant. Bledsoe was saying something above her. McAvoy was calling for EMS, even though they all knew. Lena bent over Daniel's chest and pressed her forehead against him. For one insane second, she thought she could warm him back to life if she just refused the evidence hard enough. "You said you'd be late," she whispered. "That's all you said. You said you'd be late." Her body shook with a violence that felt separate from crying. Above her, the deputies spread out. Bledsoe's voice sharpened into command. "Find the cruiser. Find Mercer." The name barely registered through the shock, but it lodged somewhere deep. Mercer, Caleb, Sarah's little brother. Daniel had stopped Caleb. Lena lifted her head slowly. Caleb was here? Bledsoe did not answer right away, which was answer enough. "Lena, don't." But the thought had already entered her, poisonous and bright. Half an hour earlier, Caleb had pulled Daniel's cruiser down the dirt service road near the old feed mill and left it angled near the creek embankment. He had tried to think of more damage to stage, but his hands were too unsteady to do much right. He wiped surfaces again, then drove back in his truck by a longer route, hoping the dark would hide him, hoping every passing minute put distance between him and the shot. It did not. Every mile only made the reality more fixed. His trailer sat on a patch of land outside town. A rusted mailbox at the road, 2 dead appliances beside the porch he kept meaning to haul off. When he pulled in, the place looked exactly as it had that morning, and the normalcy felt obscene. The porch light glowed yellow. A moth beat itself stupid against the bulb. Caleb sat in the truck for a long time without moving. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. Sarah. The name on the screen punched the air out of him. He watched it ring until it stopped. Then it buzzed again. He couldn't answer, couldn't hear her voice, couldn't survive what she might say if she already knew. He got out and walked inside, revolver in hand because he still had not decided whether it was evidence, protection, or a sentence waiting to be carried out. The trailer smelled like old coffee and drywall dust. An unfinished kitchen remodel had left cabinet doors stacked by the wall. Caleb set Daniel's phone, wallet, and badge on the table and stared at them. They looked like props from a crime show, except real things had weight, real things accused. His own phone buzzed again. Then again. Sarah. Then his mother. Then a number from the sheriff's office. Caleb backed away from the table as if the objects there might suddenly speak. He went to the sink and splashed water on his face. In the mirror above it, he saw a man already halfway gone. "You can still leave," he muttered to himself. "Drive south, cross the state line, keep going." But another voice answered from somewhere deeper, quieter, crueler. "And do what? Live as what?" He thought of Sarah's face if he vanished tonight. He thought of little Emmy asking where Daddy was. He thought of Lena, who had never fully trusted him and now would have reason enough to hate him until one of them died. He gripped the edge of the sink until his fingers hurt. There had always been a point in his bad decisions where he imagined he could reverse course, confess, apologize, make restitution. Tonight had burned that fantasy to ash. A knock at the door made him jump so violently his elbow hit the faucet. Water splashed across the counter. Another knock came, harder this time. "Caleb." Sarah's voice. Not on the phone. "Here." He closed his eyes. Of course she would come. She lived 15 minutes away. She would drive straight here, the second she heard Daniel had gone missing after stopping him. Panic surged, but there was no room left to run. Caleb, open the damn door. He wiped his face with both hands, shoved Daniel's things under a dish towel on the table without thinking, and went to the door. Sarah Mercer Holt stood on the porch in jeans and a church fundraiser t-shirt, hair pulled back badly like she had done it in the car. Her eyes were wide and fever-bright. "Where is he?" she asked before Caleb said a word. Caleb stared at her. Sarah was older by 9 years, practical where he was reckless. The sister who had turned 18 and immediately become half-mother to him after their father drank himself into the ground. She could still make him feel 12 with one look. Tonight that look was terror mixed with dawning certainty. "Where's Daniel?" she said again. "Sarah, I don't." She shoved him backward with both hands and stepped inside. "Don't lie to me." She looked around the trailer, breathing fast, as if Daniel might be tied up in the bathroom. "Sheriff called Mom. They found blood on the road. They said Daniel stopped you. Why did Daniel stop you?" Caleb's chest tightened. "Sarah, why did he stop you?" Her voice cracked into a shout. "Because if something happened to him, and it started with you, I swear to God, Caleb." He flinched before she even finished. The gesture told her enough. Sarah went still, truly still. Her face changed in stages, like a room losing power. First anger, then disbelief, then a kind of awful recognition. "No," she said softly. "No." Caleb opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Sarah's gaze dropped to his shirt, where a tiny dark speck still stained the hem from where he had tried to wipe the gun. Then to his shaking hands. Then to the revolver sitting on the counter by the sink. She looked back up at him. "Tell me I'm wrong." Caleb felt the world narrowing around the two of them. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Sarah stared as if the words had come from a stranger. "Oh my God." She stumbled backward one step, hand rising to her mouth. "Oh my God, Caleb." "He grabbed me. He went for the gun." I panicked. "You shot Daniel?" Her voice broke on Daniel's name. "You shot my husband?" Caleb's own eyes filled suddenly, hot and humiliating. "Sarah, I didn't mean..." She slapped him so hard his head snapped to the side. The sound cracked through the trailer. Caleb did not move. He almost welcomed it. Sarah stood there shaking, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Do you know what you did?" she whispered. "Do you understand what you took from me?" Caleb looked at her and saw not just his sister, but the accumulated years of every time she had covered for him, loaned him money, defended him to people who were tired of defending him. Something inside him sagged. "I'm sorry," Sarah laughed once. A broken, disbelieving sound. "Sorry." She wiped angrily at her face. "Lena is out there with the sheriff right now. Emmy is asleep at Mom's house. You killed a father, Caleb. You killed a husband. You killed a man who spent half his life trying to keep your stupid ass alive." Each sentence landed like a hammer. Caleb could not argue, because every word was true. Sarah looked around the trailer, eyes sharp now through the tears, and saw the dish towel partly covering Daniel's wallet. Her face hardened further. She snatched the towel away. Badge, phone, wallet. She turned back to Caleb with a look so cold it almost steadied her. "You robbed his body?" "I was scared." "You were scared." She let out a breath that sounded like disgust given physical form. "There is something rotten in you, and I kept pretending there wasn't." Caleb took one step toward her. "Sarah, listen to me. I can fix, you cannot fix this." She grabbed Daniel's phone and badge, clutching them to her chest. "You are going to turn yourself in." He said nothing. That silence was enough to frighten her all over again. "Caleb." His jaw tightened. "If I walk into that station, I'm dead anyway." "No. You think they'll let me live after this? Then maybe you should have thought of that before you pulled the trigger." The words came out vicious, but behind them was something worse than anger. It was grief, beginning to choose a shape. Caleb looked away. "I can't." Sarah stared at him. Then she nodded slowly, like a juror reaching a verdict she hates. "Okay." She backed toward the door. "Then I'll do it." Caleb's head snapped up. "Sarah, I'll call Tom right now. I'll tell him what you said." "Sarah, don't." She pulled her phone from her pocket with shaking fingers. Caleb moved before he made a decision to move. 3 strides across the trailer, his hand closing over her wrist, her gasp, the phone dropping to the floor. They froze like that, both horrified by the contact. "Let go of me," she said, voice low and deadly. Caleb released her at once, as if waking from a trance. "I'm not going to hurt you." Sarah looked at him with naked revulsion. "You already did." Outside, tires crunched on gravel. Blue lights flashed through the thin trailer curtains. Caleb turned toward the window. The sheriff had arrived. Sarah didn't look surprised. She had come ready for this possibility. Maybe she had already texted someone from the car. Maybe the whole county was shrinking in around him exactly as it should. She bent, picked up her phone, and stood near the door with Daniel's badge still in her other hand. Caleb looked at the gun on the counter, then at Sarah, then at the flashing lights outside. For one terrible second, the room seemed to offer him 3 futures at once, all of them ruined. He could grab the gun and force his way out, which would end with more blood and no road home. He could put the gun in his own mouth and spare everyone the trial. Or he could open the door and face what was already his. The blue lights painted Sarah's face in pulses of red and cobalt. She looked exhausted, ancient, and absolutely done with him. Caleb suddenly remembered being 10 years old, sitting on the hood of their father's truck while Sarah, 19 then, bandaged his scraped knee after he had wrecked his bike. He had cried more from embarrassment than pain. She had said, "You always think you can outrun consequences." At the time, he had not even known what the word meant. Now, it filled the room. A fist pounded on the trailer door. "Caleb," Sheriff Bledsoe shouted. "Open up." Caleb took a breath that seemed to scrape his lungs raw. He reached for the revolver, and Sarah tensed, but instead of raising it, he opened the cylinder with clumsy fingers, dumped the remaining rounds into his palm, and set both gun and bullets on the counter. Then he lifted his empty hands. "Tell him not to come in shooting," he said quietly. Sarah held his gaze for a long moment. Something passed across her face. Not forgiveness, not even pity, just the tired acknowledgement that one final decent choice had been made too late to matter much. She opened the door. Sheriff Bledsoe stood there with 2 deputies behind him, weapons drawn but not yet raised. The humid night pressed in around them. Sarah stepped aside. Caleb walked forward slowly, hands still up, and said the only true thing left in him. "I killed Daniel. I killed Daniel." Nobody moved for a beat after he said it. Even the deputies seemed thrown by the plainness of it. Sheriff Bledsoe lowered his gun first, not all the way, but enough to signal the moment had changed. "Step outside," he said. Caleb nodded once, and walked barefoot down the trailer, steps into the wash of blue lights. The gravel bit into the soles of his feet. He turned and placed his hands on the hood of the cruiser without being told, forehead almost touching the warm metal, while Deputy McAvoy came up behind him and snapped the cuffs on. The click of the steel sounded final in a way the gunshot had not. The gunshot had been chaos. This was structure. This was the world rebuilding itself around what he had done. Sarah stood in the doorway, clutching Daniel's badge and phone against her chest, her face wet and vacant. She looked like she had already spent a year surviving the next 10 minutes. Bledsoe glanced at her, then back at Caleb. "Any weapons besides the revolver inside?" "No." "Anybody else involved?" Caleb closed his eyes. This was the first fork after confession. He saw it clearly. He could tell the whole truth. He could start naming the men Daniel had been asking about. The shipments, the late-night runs, the cash jobs that were never really construction. Or he could cling to what little was left of the half-life he'd been living, protect people who would not protect him, and make Daniel's death smaller than it really was. Shame pressed into his ribs. "No," he said at last. Sarah made a sound behind him, not a word, just a raw note of disgust. Bledsoe studied him for a long second, like he knew that silence had weight. "Put him in back," he said. McAvoy guided Caleb toward the SUV. As he passed the open trailer door, he met Sarah's eyes for 1 second. He wanted to say something that would bridge the impossible distance between them. "I'm sorry. Take care of Mom. Tell Emmy I loved him too, though the child was not his." None of it survived the look on her face. There are moments when blood relation becomes a historical fact instead of a living bond. Caleb understood that now. He got into the back seat. The door shut. The window reflected his own face back at him behind the ghosted spin of blue light. Bledsoe leaned in through the open front door before getting behind the wheel. "Where's the cruiser?" Caleb swallowed. "Service road by the old feed mill, near the creek." Bledsoe nodded tightly and radioed it in. Sarah did not come outside again. Through the trailer window, Caleb saw her moving once, a blurred shape crossing the room, then disappearing. He told himself that was better. He did not deserve a final look. The SUV pulled away, tires grinding over gravel, and Caleb watched the dark road unspool ahead. Ashford County at night had always felt small enough to hold in one hand. Tonight it felt endless. At the substation, Lena sat alone in Bledsoe's office because nobody had known where else to put her. Someone had brought her water she had not touched. Someone else had found a blanket and draped it over the back of the chair, even though the room was too warm. She had stopped crying 40 minutes earlier, which frightened her more than the crying had. Grief had not left. It had simply changed shape into something flatter and more dangerous. Daniel's wedding ring lay in a clear evidence bag on the desk, tagged and labeled, because protocol did not care that she knew every mark on it. Bledsoe had told her as gently as he could that they needed to process everything first. She had nodded, as if that made sense. She was staring at the bag when the station door opened out front and voices entered with it. Her body knew Caleb was there before she heard his name. She stood so fast, the chair legs scraped loud against the tile. The office door opened. Bledsoe filled the frame, tired and older than he had 3 hours earlier. Lena. She looked past him. Caleb was being walked down the hall in cuffs, head lowered, shirt wrinkled and stained, face hollow under the fluorescent lights. He looked smaller than she had ever seen him. Smaller and yet somehow still too large for the corridor, too present for the wreckage he had caused. "Get out of the way," she said. Bledsoe didn't move. "Lena, move." Her voice was calm now, which made it more frightening. Bledsoe hesitated. It was enough. She stepped around him and into the hall just as McAvoy paused with Caleb near booking. Caleb lifted his head. Their eyes met. In that instant, Lena saw 10 years of family holidays, awkward cookouts, Daniel refusing to give up on Caleb even when everyone else had. And then she saw the ditch, the blood, Daniel's face under the flashlight. She crossed the distance before anyone could stop her and hit Caleb hard across the mouth with the heel of her hand. His head snapped sideways. McAvoy reached for her, but she was already backing up, breathing hard, one hand shaking at her side. "That was for making me look at him like that," she said. Caleb slowly turned his face back toward her. Blood touched the corner of his lip. He did not wipe it away. "Lena," he said, and his voice broke on her name. "Don't." She pointed at him with a trembling finger. "You do not get to say my name like you know me." The station had gone silent. Even the dispatcher had stopped pretending not to listen. Lena stepped forward again, not to strike him this time, but because fury was the only thing holding her upright. "Did he beg you?" she asked. Caleb's breathing changed. "What? Did Daniel know it was you? Did he look at you and know his own family was about to kill him?" Bledsoe came up beside her. "That's enough." "No, it isn't." Her eyes never left Caleb's. "Answer me." Caleb stared at the floor for a second. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "He knew it was me." Lena's face folded inward in a way no one in the room would ever forget. She put a hand over her mouth and turned away, all the air leaving her at once. Bledsoe caught her elbow before she went down. Caleb shut his eyes. McAvoy moved him quickly into booking after that, because there are some forms of pain that become indecent to leave on display. Processing took under an hour. Fingerprints, property inventory, photographs. Caleb answered questions with the numb obedience of a man who had already stepped off the edge and was waiting to hit the ground. When they asked for emergency contact, he said nothing. When they asked if he wanted to make a call, he sat for a long time before saying, "My mother." They put him in a small interview room with a landline. His cuffed hands rested on the table. He stared at the receiver as if it were a venomous thing. Finally, he picked it up and dialed the number he had known since childhood. Ellen Mercer answered on the third ring. "Hello?" Her voice was tight and alert. She had not been sleeping. "Mom." Silence. Then one sharp inhale. "Caleb." He closed his eyes. Her saying his name like that undid something in him. "They told me," she said. "Not everything, but enough." He could hear a television murmuring somewhere in the house behind her, probably left on for Emmy, who would be asleep on the couch under one of Ellen's crocheted blankets. The picture of that ordinary mercy nearly broke him. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't say that to me like it means anything right now." Her voice was not loud. That made it worse. "Your sister is shattered. Lena is shattered. There's a baby asleep in my house who will wake up without a father. What exactly am I supposed to do with your apology?" Caleb's throat tightened until it hurt. "I know." "No, you don't." She was crying now, and he had heard his mother cry only twice before in his life. Once when his father died, once when Sarah lost her first pregnancy. This sound was different, less open, more like something collapsing inward. "I raised you better than this." Caleb bowed his head over the table. "I know. Did you?" she asked, and the question stripped him bare because it wasn't rhetorical. She truly wanted to know whether any part of her had reached him at all. "Mom, I never meant for this." That sentence is the anthem of ruined men. He heard her breathe, shaky, trying to gather herself. "Listen to me carefully. You tell the truth. All of it. Not just the part that keeps your shame small. Daniel is dead. You do not get to protect yourself with lies on top of that." Caleb gripped the receiver harder. He thought of the men whose names he had buried, the runs he had made, the money he had taken because it came easier than honest work and made him feel useful for 5 minutes at a time. "There are things—" "Then you tell those too." Her voice hardened in a way he had never heard. If my son has become the kind of man who kills one person and protects 10 more, then I need to know that as well. He opened his mouth, but there was nowhere left to hide. Okay, he whispered. Ellen went quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, the steel had gone out of her voice, leaving only exhaustion. I love you, she said. And the words nearly killed him because they had not been withdrawn. But, I do not recognize you tonight. The line clicked dead. Caleb sat holding the receiver long after the dial tone started. Across town, Sarah was in Daniel and Lena's house because no one trusted Lena to be alone, and no one trusted Sarah to go home yet either. The living room lamp cast a soft amber light over toys, folded laundry, unopened mail, all the domestic evidence of a life that had assumed another morning. Lena sat on the floor beside the couch, Daniel's denim jacket clutched in both hands, her eyes fixed on nothing. Sarah sat in the armchair across from her with Emmy's baby monitor in her lap, even though Emmy was not there. Habit. Pure habit. The silence between them was not hostile. It was simply too full to puncture easily. Finally, Lena said, "He loved your brother." Sarah shut her eyes. I know. That's the part I can't make fit. Lena looked down at the jacket, thumb rubbing the worn seam by the collar where Daniel always tugged it on. If it had been some drunk driver or some idiot in a robbery, I could put it somewhere in my mind. I could hate a stranger, but Daniel loved him. Sarah's voice came out thin. I know. Lena looked up then, and grief sharpened into something almost unbearable. Did you know he was in trouble? Sarah hesitated. The truthful answer was not clean. I knew Caleb was messing around with people Daniel didn't trust. I knew Daniel kept trying to pull him back. I didn't know. She stopped. Didn't know what? Didn't know Caleb could do this? But maybe some part of her had always known there was a cliff in him. Lena read the unfinished thought anyway. You didn't know he'd kill him? No. Sarah's hands started shaking. And if I had known, I would have. She broke off because there was no credible ending to that sentence. Would have stopped it. Would have called someone. Would have dragged Caleb out of town by his ear like he was 15 again. The world was full of imaginary interventions that only made sense after disaster. Lena leaned back against the couch and closed her eyes. Tom says they're charging him with first-degree murder. Sarah nodded once. Good. The words sounded brutal in the room. Lena opened her eyes again and looked at her. Do you mean that? Sarah took a long breath. I don't know what I mean. I mean Daniel should be alive. I mean I want my brother to suffer, and I hate myself for that. I mean if you ask me tomorrow, I might say something else. Lena absorbed that. Then she said quietly, he didn't act alone. Sarah looked up. What? Daniel told me 3 days ago he was close to something. She stared past Sarah, replaying it. We were in the kitchen. He was making that awful powdered lemonade he liked. And he said if he could just get one person to talk, the whole thing would break open. I thought he meant county drugs, pills, maybe copper theft, something like that. He wouldn't tell me details. She looked back at Sarah. Now Caleb kills him and hides the cruiser. That's not panic by itself. That's somebody already living in a mess big enough to swallow murder. Sarah felt the room shift under her. The family tragedy she had been clinging to as the whole map suddenly widened into something colder. Tom know this? I told him. Lena's jaw tightened. And if Caleb knows anything else, he better start talking before I decide grief is a reason to want him dead. In the jail cell, sometime after 2 in the morning, Caleb lay on the narrow bunk and stared at the concrete ceiling. Sleep would not come. Every time his eyes drifted shut, the ditch came back. Daniel's face, Sarah's look, Lena's question. Did he beg you? No. Daniel had not begged. That was somehow worse. Daniel had looked shocked first, then wounded in a deeper way, as if the betrayal had landed a half second before the bullet did. Caleb rolled onto his side and pressed his forearm over his eyes. The men from the shipments drifted through his mind now one by one. Wes Harlan with his fake contractor invoices and church-going smile. Cody Vance, who handled cash and always wore cologne too expensive for a man who claimed to pour concrete. Eli Mercer, no relation, who owned the salvage yard on the east edge of town where trucks came and went after midnight. Daniel had been right. Caleb had been a mule. Useful because he was local, because people already expected the worst from him, because when low men break rules, nobody asks who handed them the rulebook. He had taken the jobs because regular work dried up, because child support on a kid he barely got to see kept mounting, because resentment was easier to feed than dignity. He had told himself he was skimming the edges. Tonight proved there are no edges once you start lying for dangerous men. Around 4 a.m., Bledsoe came to the cell. He stood outside the bars with a paper cup of coffee in one hand and a file tucked under his arm. Caleb sat up slowly. His face felt stiff where Lena had struck him. Your mother called again. Bledsoe said. She said to tell you she meant what she said. Caleb managed a humorless nod. Sounds like her. Bledsoe looked at him for a while. Then he set the coffee down on the ledge outside the cell. I've got state investigators coming at 8. They recovered Daniel's cruiser where you said. They also recovered partial prints, shoe impressions, and signs you tried to stage the scene. Caleb looked away. Yeah, Mercer. Bledsoe's voice changed, lower now, more personal than official. I knew your daddy. Knew what that house was like after he got mean with the bottle. I gave you more grace over the years than I should have because I knew what kind of start you got. Daniel gave you more because he married into it. So don't sit there and mistake this question for kindness. Was this just you being a panicked fool, or was Daniel getting close to something bigger? Caleb stared at the concrete floor. Silence lengthened. Bledsoe did not rush it. If you lie now, the sheriff said, you're not just burying yourself. You're burying what Daniel died trying to uncover. Caleb's chest went tight again. He thought of Ellen's voice on the phone. Tell the truth. All of it. He looked up slowly. If I talk, he said, they'll come after my family. Bledsoe's eyes hardened. They already came after your family. You just did it for them. The sentence landed clean and brutal. Caleb let out a shaky breath. There it was. The last defense stripped away. Wes Harlan, he said. The name sounded strange in the cell, small for how much it contained. He used his construction company to move stolen equipment, pills, cash. Cody Vance handled collections. Eli Mercer stored things at the salvage yard. I ran deliveries. Daniel knew pieces, but not enough to pin them. Bledsoe said nothing, but something in his face settled into grim confirmation. Caleb kept going because once the wall cracked, it all started to spill. Truck routes, dead drops, fake invoices, the old feed mill used for transfers, names of county men paid to look the other way. By the time the sky outside the tiny jail window began to pale toward dawn, Caleb had said more honest words than he had in the last 3 years combined, and none of them made him feel lighter. Confession was not relief. It was excavation. It removed whatever cover still remained. At 7:30, Sarah arrived at the station with a casserole dish she had made at 3 in the morning because grief in Southern families often came wearing aluminum foil. She handed it to the receptionist without a word and asked to speak to Sheriff Bledsoe. Her eyes were swollen but dry. She had changed clothes, brushed her hair, and put on mascara she did not need. Armor. Bledsoe met her in the hallway outside his office. You should be home. Home is useless right now. She looked past him. Is he talking? Bledsoe hesitated, then nodded once. Some. Sarah closed her eyes briefly. Good. You don't want to see him. She opened them again. No, I really don't. But she did, and they both knew it. Not to forgive him, not to comfort him, to understand what kind of face her brother wore now that the pretending had burned off. Bledsoe studied her, then finally said, 5 minutes. Through the glass, Caleb was led into the visitation booth 10 minutes later and sat down behind the scratched plexiglass. He picked up the phone on his side when he saw Sarah already holding the one on hers. For a moment, neither spoke. The partition turned them into images from separate lives. Sarah looked composed in that dangerous way people do when they have not yet had time to collapse. Caleb looked older by a decade. Mom told you to talk, she said. Yeah. Are you? He nodded. Sarah breathed out slowly. Then do not stop it enough. Do not give them the cleaned-up version, where you're just a hothead and Daniel had bad luck. You tell them everything that touched his death. Caleb swallowed. I am. Sarah held his gaze. Good. Silence settled again. Through the glass, he could see the strain around her eyes, the tiny tremor in her jaw she was fighting. I don't know how to carry this, he said at last. That isn't my problem anymore. The words were cold, but grief lived under them, vast and shuddering. Caleb nodded because he deserved worse. Sarah's eyes flicked down, then back up. Lena said Daniel was onto something. He was. And? Caleb pressed his lips together. And I should have listened when he told me to get out. Sarah stared at him, furious tears threatening again. You always do that. Do what? Turn confession into self-pity. She leaned toward the glass. This is not a tragedy because you ignored good advice. This is a tragedy because a decent man tried to save you, and you put him in the ground. Caleb flinched as if struck. Sarah kept going, her voice low and shaking now. I loved you. I need you to understand that. Past tense or present tense. I can't even sort it out right now, but I loved you enough to keep hoping. Daniel loved you too, and now every memory I have of both of you is contaminated. The word hung there like poison in water. Caleb felt something in his chest cave inward. I know. No. She shook her head. You don't. Because I still have to go tell Emmy one day what happened to her daddy, And I still have to sit across from Mom at Thanksgiving if she's alive by then. And I still have to wake up tomorrow as the sister of the man who murdered my husband. Her voice finally broke. You get to go to prison and have a name for what you are. I have to keep being everyone else around it. Caleb could not speak. Sarah lowered her eyes for a moment, gathered herself, then set the phone down without another word, and walked out. Caleb stayed seated after the line went dead, staring at the empty chair she had left behind, understanding at last that prison would not be the deepest sentence handed down that week. Caleb stayed seated after the line went dead, staring at the empty chair she had left behind, understanding at last that prison would not be the deepest sentence handed down that week. By noon, the station had turned into the kind of controlled storm that only small counties produce when a private tragedy becomes public business. State investigators came in wearing pressed shirts and tired expressions, carrying folders and equipment cases, asking careful questions in voices too neutral to be comforting. Deputies moved in and out with paper cups of coffee and evidence bags. Reporters started calling, then showing up outside, when the scanner traffic spread far enough. Somebody from Little Rock parked a satellite van across the street from the courthouse lawn, and the sight of it made locals slow down their trucks to stare. Ashford was used to funerals, bad weather, and quiet corruption. It was not used to a deputy sheriff being shot by his own wife's brother on a county road. Inside Bledsoe's office, the blinds were half closed against the flashing camera lights outside. Sheriff Bledsoe sat at his desk with Lena across from him and Sarah in the chair against the wall, both women looking like different versions of the same sleepless truth. Lena had changed into black jeans and one of Daniel's old gray hoodies, the sleeves pulled over her hands. Sarah held a legal pad in her lap and had not written a thing on it. It was there to give her fingers something to hold besides grief. Bledsoe had just finished explaining the broad outline of what Caleb had disclosed. He kept his tone practical because anything softer would come apart. State police are moving on the warrants now, he said. Harlan's office, Vance's place, the salvage yard. We've got enough for searches and enough to hold them if they're dumb enough to resist. Lena stared at him. Daniel died over stolen equipment and pill money? It's bigger than that, Bledsoe said. Looks like they were moving opioids, cash, and equipment through shell jobs. Maybe more. Caleb says Daniel was close. Sarah gave a small, joyless laugh. Of course he was. Daniel could smell a lie through concrete. The sentence hung there. None of them smiled. Bledsoe folded his hands. I need to ask you both something difficult. Lena looked up. You're assuming I'm still in the mood for easy things. He nodded, accepting that. If these men think Caleb talked, or if they think Daniel left notes with either of you, I need to know where you'll be tonight, and who'll be with you. Sarah straightened. You think they'd come after us? I think desperate men get stupid fast. Lena's face hardened instead of blanching. Let them. Bledsoe shook his head. That kind of talk sounds strong until somebody puts a brick through your kitchen window. Sarah turned toward Lena. You're not staying alone. Neither are you. I've got Mom, and I've got Daniel's house full of his things. Her voice finally cracked on the last word, and she looked down at her covered hands. I don't know how to walk through those rooms by myself. Sarah's expression softened despite everything. Then don't. Bledsoe exhaled quietly, relieved by the first sane idea offered all morning. Good. Stay together. I'll put a unit outside Ellen's place and another slow roll through Lena's street until this settles. Lena closed her eyes for a second, then opened them again. I want to see the road. Bledsoe frowned. No, I wasn't asking. Sarah turned sharply. Lena, I need to see it. She looked between them, daring either to call it irrational. Everyone else has seen the place where my husband died. They've drawn diagrams and taken photographs and talked about trajectories. I want to stand there while it still means something real. Bledsoe rubbed a hand over his jaw. It was a bad idea. He knew it. Sarah knew it. Lena knew it too. And that was why she insisted. Not alone, he said finally. And not long. The road looked smaller in daylight. That was the first thing Lena thought when Bledsoe drove her out there just after lunch. The ditch was ordinary. The shoulder was narrow. A patch of flattened weeds marked where Daniel had lain. There was dried blood in the dirt darker than the surrounding clay, and yellow evidence flags still stood in place, absurdly bright under the noon sun. The whole setting offended her with its normalcy. She had expected something cinematic, something dramatic enough to match what it held. Instead, it looked like any county road where somebody might change a tire or toss a beer can. Lena stepped out of the SUV and felt the heat hit her face. Cicadas buzzed in the trees. A semi rumbled somewhere far off. Bledsoe stayed near the vehicle, giving her space without abandoning her. She walked slowly to the shoulder and stared down into the ditch. She did not cry. The tears had moved deeper, into whatever part of a person remains after shock starts hardening into memory. He would have hated this. she said at last. Bledsoe didn't ask what she meant. Being looked at, she said. Being turned into a story everybody tells. Bledsoe leaned one arm on the SUV roof. Daniel knew the job. Daniel knew traffic stops and meth houses and domestics on Christmas Eve. He did not sign up to become the county's cautionary tale. She crouched by the dried blood and pressed her fingertips into the grass beside it without touching the stain itself. You know what he used to say when he left for work? Bledsoe shook his head. He'd kiss our daughter and say, "Don't let your mama marry anybody better looking if I'm late." Every single time. Same dumb joke. Her mouth twisted, not into a smile, but into its exhausted ghost. Now I'm standing in a ditch because my brother-in-law shot him, and there's still probably a coffee mug in the sink from this morning. Bledsoe looked away toward the fields. In law enforcement, there are facts and there is aftermath. Facts fit in reports. Aftermath never does. Lena stood up again and faced the road. Did he suffer? She asked. The question was flat, almost businesslike. Bledsoe answered the same way. Medical examiner says it was fast. Lena nodded once. Good. She did not say why that mattered. But Bledsoe heard it anyway. Good that Daniel had not laid there long. Good that betrayal had not had time to become pleading. Good that one mercy, however small, had survived the night. Back at the station, Caleb sat through another round of interviews while state investigator Andrea Kessler took notes with the patience of someone who had spent 15 years listening to men discover honesty only after consequences cornered them. She was in her 40s, hair pinned back, suit jacket off, sleeves rolled neatly to the forearms. She gave him no visible disgust and no sympathy either. Start with Harlan, she said. Not the version you told yourself, the first true version. Caleb sat with his cuffed hands folded on the table and stared at the knot in the wood grain. I met him on a roofing job 2 years ago. He said he had side work, cash, moving supplies after hours. Did you know then? Not all of it. Enough to know it wasn't clean. Kessler nodded for him to continue. At first, it was generators, compressors, stuff that could pass as contractor inventory. Then it got to pills, small packages, taped up, no labels. I asked once, and Cody told me if I wanted details, I was in the wrong line of work. Kessler's pen moved steadily. And you kept going. Yeah. Why? Caleb almost laughed, but there was nothing humorous in it. Because when people expect you to fail, getting paid for it can feel like winning. Kessler looked up at that, not softened, just more attentive. That sounds like something you've rehearsed. No, Caleb said. That sounds like the truth when I'm too tired to dress it up. He told her about late-night pickups at the salvage yard, fake work orders, tool trailers loaded with things that had never belonged to any job site in Ashford County. He told her about Daniel asking questions in the months before the shooting, and about how Caleb had started ducking family dinners because Daniel's eyes had become too difficult to sit across from. He spoke until the room seemed drained of air. When Kessler finally paused, she set her pen down and folded her arms. Last chance to make yourself less useful to us, she said. Was anybody expecting you and Daniel to meet on that road? Caleb frowned. No, it was a traffic stop. Did Harlan know Daniel was onto him? Caleb thought about it. He knew Daniel was asking around. He started saying maybe the deputy needed a reminder about minding county lines. Kessler's expression did not change, but something sharpened in her eyes. A reminder. Yeah, Caleb swallowed. I didn't think he meant kill him. No, Kessler said evenly. That was your part. The sentence sat between them without mercy. Caleb accepted it because there was nothing else to do. At Ellen Mercer's house, the afternoon brought casseroles, pound cakes, paper plates, and the low murmur of women who had spent their lives turning grief into logistics. Church ladies filled the kitchen as if summoned by weather. One labeled containers with masking tape. Another sorted toys to keep Emmy occupied later. A third vacuumed the hallway without being asked because movement was easier than witnessing. Ellen stood at the stove, stirring beans she did not intend to eat, listening to them move around her home like a support system made of habit and aluminum pans. She had lived in Ashford long enough to know exactly what kindness looked like here. It looked like covered dishes and folded laundry, and people pretending not to notice that your family had just become a scandal. Sarah came in through the back door around 3. The second Ellen saw her daughter's face, she turned off the burner and opened her arms. Sarah went into them wordlessly. For a moment, she was not a widow's sister or a witness or an adult with responsibilities. She was just a child who had held too much for too long. Ellen held her and stared over her shoulder at the kitchen window. Did you see him? She asked quietly. Sarah nodded against her shoulder. And? Sarah pulled back. He looked like Caleb. Ellen flinched at that, more than she would have if Sarah had said he looked monstrous. The ordinary resemblance was its own injury. Sarah scrubbed at her face and glanced around the kitchen full of women lowering their eyes politely. Where's Emmy? Napping. And Lena? At her house with Tom. He said he'd bring her here before dark. Sarah nodded. She moved to the sink and stared out at the backyard swing set where Emmy liked to throw herself too high, while Daniel pretended not to panic. Ellen watched her daughter's back for a while before speaking again. Do you hate your brother? Sarah did not turn around. Right now? Yes. Sarah exhaled slowly. Right now, I hate that I can't answer that cleanly. Ellen accepted that because clean answers were for other families. Your father used to say hatred was easier than mourning because it gives grief a direction. Sarah turned then, eyes rimmed red. Well, he'd know. Ellen almost smiled, though it hurt. Yes, he would. The mention of their father put a colder history in the room. Sarah leaned against the counter. Did we make him this way? Ellen stiffened. No, Mom, no. Ellen. Set the spoon down harder than intended. Your father gave that boy a mean education in fear and shame, but plenty of boys survive bad fathers without killing decent men in ditches. Do not turn Caleb's choice into family folklore. He made it. He owns it. Sarah held her mother's gaze and saw the cost of that clarity. It was the only way Ellen could keep from drowning in guilt of her own. Sarah nodded once. Okay. That evening, as the heat finally started to loosen its grip on the county, state police rolled onto Harlan Construction's lot with warrants. Caleb sat in his cell and did not see it, but the consequences of his words were moving now through places he knew by smell and dust and habit. Men and windbreakers searched file cabinets, trailers, and shop bays. They found invoice books with duplicate numbering, pill residue in a lockbox behind a welder, and a hard drive hidden inside a cooler of deer meat in the break room freezer. At the salvage yard, Eli Mercer cursed and claimed harassment until they opened a shipping container stacked with stolen generators and unopened painkiller cartons stamped for hospital distribution 3 states away. Cody Vance tried to run out a side door of his rental house in gym shorts and one boot, which made the local evening news in less than an hour. Ashford County, for one strange night, had bigger scandal than a family murder. It did not comfort anyone who mattered. Lena arrived at Ellen's house just after sunset, with Bledsoe behind her carrying 2 overnight bags from Daniel's place. She looked emptied out in a new way, as if the visit to the road had scraped her hollow. Ellen met her at the door and took one of the bags without speaking. The women of the church had thinned out by then, leaving only the smell of ham and starch and coffee. Emmy was awake in the den, watching cartoons too brightly, one sock on and one sock off, unaware that the air around every adult had changed shape forever. When she saw Lena, she ran over yelling, "Mama!" and Lena dropped to her knees and caught her so fiercely the child squealed in surprise. Then Lena buried her face in her daughter's hair and held on too long. Sarah stood in the doorway watching, one hand over her mouth. Ellen looked at Bledsoe over Lena's bent head. He gave the slightest shake of his own. No developments he could say in front of the child. No safety concerns urgent enough to speak aloud. Just the ongoing labor of catastrophe. After Emmy was tucked into the guest room later, the 4 adults sat on the back porch under the yellow bug light while crickets hissed in the dark. The yard smelled of cut grass and damp earth. Bledsoe had a legal pad on his knee. Lena had Daniel's jacket over her shoulders despite the warmth. Sarah held a glass of sweet tea gone mostly melted. Ellen rocked slowly in the old wicker chair that complained at every shift of weight. Funeral home called, Ellen said. They can meet in the morning. Lena stared out into the dark. I don't want him in a suit. Sarah looked over. Okay. He hated suits. Said they made him look like a youth pastor with a gambling problem. The sentence landed, and, impossibly, all 3 women let out brief, cracked laughs that dissolved almost immediately into something more wounded. Lena rubbed her eyes. Sorry, don't, Ellen said. Sometimes laughter is just pain changing hats. Bledsoe cleared his throat softly, glancing down at his notes. Caleb's statement gave enough probable cause to charge Harlan and the others. Kessler thinks the case is real, not airtight yet, but real. Lena's gaze shifted to him. And Caleb? Booked on first-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, evidence tampering, and more once the rest shakes out. Good, Sarah said again. But this time the word came quieter, exhausted rather than sharp. Bledsoe looked at her. There'll be hearings, press, maybe plea negotiations, if he keeps cooperating. Lena's shoulders stiffened. No. Lena. No deals that make it sound like Daniel was incidental. No story where Caleb becomes some brave whistleblower who just made one terrible mistake. Bledsoe held her gaze. That's not my call alone. Then whoever gets that call better come say it to my face. Sarah set down her glass with deliberate care. He talks because Daniel is dead. Not because he grew a conscience. Bledsoe nodded slowly. I know. Ellen stopped rocking. What does Caleb get if he keeps talking? The question dropped heavily among them. Bledsoe chose his words. Maybe they consider cooperation at sentencing. Depends on the prosecutor. Depends how much he gives. Lena looked away into the yard. So Daniel saves the county in death, and Caleb gets credit for helping explain it. Bledsoe had no answer to that, because the justice system often ran on bargains that made moral sense only from very far away. The porch fell quiet again. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked twice and stopped. Finally, Ellen said, Tomorrow we bury a husband and a father. The law can do what it does after that, but tomorrow belongs to Daniel. The words steadied the porch in a way nothing else had. They all nodded, even Bledsoe. Much later, long after the house had gone still, Lena lay awake in the guest bed, with Emmy curled against her side and Sarah in the twin bed across the room, pretending to sleep. Moonlight cut a pale stripe across the floorboards. Lena stared at the ceiling and replayed Daniel's voice in fragments because whole memories hurt too much. Him singing badly while grilling burgers. Him muttering over paperwork at the dining table. Him saying, I know your family's messy, but I married the whole weather system. She let out one involuntary laugh through her nose and immediately covered her mouth with her hand. Across the room, Sarah whispered into the dark. I heard that. Lena wiped at her eyes. He said that to me once after Thanksgiving. Sarah was silent for a moment. Then she said, Sounds like him. More silence. Then, Lena asked the question that had been waiting between them all evening. Are you going to go see Caleb again? Sarah stared into the dark above her own bed. I don't know. Do you want to? Sarah thought about the visitation booth, the glass, the broken thing her brother had become, and the older broken thing he had probably been for years without her letting herself name it. No, she said. Yes, maybe. Not for him. For you? For the version of me that still thinks I can make people account for what they've done if I just use the right words. Lena turned her head on the pillow. You can't. I know. Sarah swallowed. That doesn't stop me wanting to try. Lena looked back at the ceiling. If you go, don't bring me back anything human about him. The honesty of that request sat raw in the room. Sarah answered just as honestly. I can't promise that. He was human when he did it. That's the worst part. Lena shut her eyes. A long minute passed. I hate that you're right. In his cell across town, Caleb was not sleeping either. He sat on the bunk with his elbows on his knees, listening to the low hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional clank from elsewhere in the jail. Kessler had left him with a legal pad and told him to write down anything else he remembered before morning. Names, dates, routes. He had stared at the blank page for an hour before writing Daniel's name at the top without meaning to. It looked wrong there, too simple. He thought about the funeral tomorrow, the church on Maple Street, the line of patrol cars, the county turning out in pressed shirts and dark dresses. He would not be there. Maybe that was mercy. Maybe it was another form of cowardice. He pictured Daniel's casket and felt a fresh wave of nausea, not because death had become new again, but because funerals freeze a life into one public version, and Daniel deserved better than being remembered through Caleb's crime. He picked up the pen and, under Daniel's name, began writing everything else. Harlan's numbers, storage locations, men who took envelopes in parking lots, a deputy from another county who liked cash too much. He wrote until his hand cramped. It did not feel redemptive. It felt like sanding skin off a wound. But as the page filled, one thought began to press through the misery with painful clarity. Daniel had spent the last stretch of his life trying to drag truth into daylight. Caleb had answered him with a bullet. The least obscene thing left to do now was stop answering him with silence. By dawn, the legal pad held 6 full pages, and Caleb knew the story had moved past the point where any confession could save him, which was exactly why he finally believed it might matter. By dawn, the legal pad held 6 full pages, and Caleb knew the story had moved past the point where any confession could save him, which was exactly why he finally believed it might matter. The funeral began under a white Arkansas sky that looked too clean for the day it covered. Patrol cars lined Maple Street in a blue and silver row, hoods gleaming in the morning sun. Men in uniform stood near the church steps with their hats tucked under one arm, faces arranged into solemn lines that kept slipping around the edges whenever someone mentioned Daniel's name. Women from the congregation moved through the fellowship hall, balancing trays of ham biscuits and coffee urns because grief still needed feeding. The bell in the steeple rang, slow and steady. Lena sat in the front pew in a black dress she had not remembered buying, Emmy in her lap for the first half hour, until Ellen quietly took the child to the nursery, when the crowd grew too thick and the organ too loud. Sarah sat on Lena's other side, shoulders straight, hands locked together so tightly her rings pressed red half-moons into her skin. Every few minutes someone leaned in to whisper how sorry they were, how Daniel had been a good man, how none of this made sense. Lena nodded because there was no polite way to answer the truth, which was that condolences often sounded like people trying to step around a sinkhole without looking directly into it. At the back of the church, Sheriff Bledsoe stood beside 2 state troopers and watched the room fill until there was standing room only. Daniel had arrested some of these people, testified against a few, helped repair a few more. In a county like Ashford, a deputy's life crossed too many others to keep categories clean. Kessler was there too, in a dark suit, holding herself with the same composed reserve she wore in interview rooms. She did not belong to the family, but she understood enough not to stay away. The casket at the front was open for the first hour, and Lena had almost refused that part until she saw Daniel laid out in his sheriff's dress blues with his face restored to something close to peace. Not him, not fully, but not the ditch either. That mattered more than she had expected. She had stood there before the service began, with one hand on the polished wood, and whispered, "You look ridiculous in this suit," because he would have wanted one last complaint. Then she had laughed once and cried hard enough that Ellen had to hold her upright. Now the pastor stepped to the pulpit and spoke in the practiced cadence of men who had ushered many families through the same impossible threshold. He talked about service, duty, devotion, kindness. He talked about Daniel coaching Little League, carrying groceries for church widows, fixing the storm-damaged roof at the fellowship hall without sending a bill. He said Daniel believed a community only worked if somebody kept showing up when showing up was inconvenient. That was true. It was also too small. Lena sat rigid, hearing all the public pieces of her husband and silently supplying the rest. Daniel making pancakes badly but confidently. Daniel leaving drawers open all over the house like he was in a silent war with hinges. Daniel putting one cold foot against her calf in bed just to hear her cuss at him. The pastor's words were not wrong. They were simply not enough to contain the private dimensions of a life. Then Sheriff Bledsoe was invited forward, and the air in the church changed. He stepped up slowly, hat in hand, shoulders heavier than usual. He looked out over the pews for a long moment before speaking. "I had a prepared version of this," he said. "It was decent. It was polished. It said the right things in the right order." A few people let out tired, nervous breaths that were almost laughter. Bledsoe nodded. But Daniel hated polished speeches. He said when people die, the living always get suspiciously eloquent. A ripple of real laughter moved through the church this time, brief and aching. Lena bowed her head. "Yes," she thought. "Exactly." Bledsoe went on. "Daniel Rourke was a good deputy, and he was a better man than that title explains. He was stubborn without being showy about it. He was brave without making a speech about courage. He was the kind of man who would keep asking one more question after everyone else got tired of asking, because he believed the truth did not become less important just because it became inconvenient." His voice roughened slightly there, and the congregation felt the undercurrent beneath the words. This county owes him more than condolences. It owes him honesty. It owes him the kind of memory that doesn't get cleaned up for comfort. Sarah looked down at her hands. Lena did not move at all. Bledsoe's gaze found them in the front pew. "Daniel loved his family fiercely. That's the thing I want said plain today. Whatever else gets written or talked about in the weeks ahead, whatever noise comes from courtrooms or newspapers or people trying to turn this into a lesson that flatters themselves, the center of this man's life was love. Love for his wife. Love for his daughter. Love for his people, even when they made it difficult, especially then." The words landed like stones in water, rippling through the room until they reached the place where Caleb's absence sat heavier than a body. Bledsoe did not name him. He did not need to. Everyone present knew which difficult love had become fatal. When the service ended and the casket was carried out, the honor guard moved in practiced precision. Boots struck pavement in measured rhythm. The flag was folded. Rifles fired their salute over the cemetery hill, and Emmy, who had been brought back for the graveside, jumped and began to cry because loud sounds still belonged to the world of little girls, not memorial ritual. Lena took her from Ellen and held her tight while the bugler played taps. The notes drifted out thin and lonely over the headstones and the late summer grass, and something in Sarah finally gave way. She bent forward with both hands over her face and sobbed once, sharply, as though the sound had been torn out of her. Ellen put an arm around her shoulders, and Sarah leaned into her mother like the years between childhood and now had briefly collapsed. Lena did not cry then. She had gone beyond tears for the moment. She watched 2 deputies kneel to present the folded flag, and felt detached enough to notice absurd details, like the fact that one deputy's boots needed polishing. Then the younger one held the flag out and said, "On behalf of a grateful county," and Lena almost laughed at the phrasing because gratitude had nothing to do with the grave in front of her. She took the flag with both hands anyway. It was surprisingly heavy. "Thank you," she said, because the deputy looked young enough to break if she didn't. After most of the crowd had drifted toward cars and casseroles and the practical aftermath of burial, Lena stayed behind at the graveside with Sarah and Ellen, while workers stood at a respectful distance, pretending not to wait. The cemetery sat on a rise overlooking soybean fields and a narrow stretch of highway. Traffic moved in the distance, indifferent and constant. Emmy had fallen asleep against Ellen's shoulder, exhausted by unfamiliar sorrow and too many grown-up faces. Sarah stared at Daniel's casket one last time before it was lowered. "He really loved that stupid truck," she murmured. Lena looked over, startled by the sudden sentence. "What? That old F-150. The one with the busted AC. He talked about it like it was his third child." For the first time all day, Lena smiled for real, though it hurt. He said real men drove trucks with problems. He said that because he was too cheap to fix it. Also true. The smile vanished as quickly as it came, but its presence had mattered. It proved Daniel was still large enough to contain humor. Ellen shifted Emmy on her hip and looked out over the fields. "Your father," she said quietly, surprising them both, "used to think funerals were for the dead. They're not. They're for the living to see whether they can stand next to the hole and still remain standing." Sarah wiped her face with the heel of her hand. "And?" Ellen looked at the grave. "Ask me tomorrow." At the jail, Caleb heard the distant gun salute through a cracked window in the corridor outside his cell. 3 volleys, faint but unmistakable. He had known the funeral would be around that time. He had tried not to count the hours leading to it, but his body had done it anyway. When the shots sounded, he stood from the bunk and moved to the bars before he could stop himself. As though proximity to noise might offer proximity to mourning. It did not. The corridor was empty. Light from the high window cut a white rectangle across the floor. Caleb gripped the bars and closed his eyes. He pictured Daniel's casket, the uniforms, Lena's face, Sarah's face, his mother's hands around Emmy's shoulders. He pictured himself absent from the one place his guilt most belonged. There was justice in that, but no relief. A few minutes later, Kessler appeared outside the cell with a folder under one arm. "Search has turned up enough to make your statement useful," she said. "Harlan's talking now that he knows Vance is too." Caleb let out a breath that almost became a laugh. "Cowards. Usually." She looked at him a little more closely. "You heard the shots." It was not a question. Caleb nodded once. Kessler's face remained professionally still, but her voice changed a fraction. "There'll be an arraignment tomorrow. Prosecutors considering whether your cooperation changes any recommendations." Caleb opened his eyes and looked at her. "It shouldn't." She studied him. "That's not your call." "No." He stepped back from the bars and sat on the bunk again. "Nothing is." Kessler stayed there another moment. "For what it's worth, Daniel's widow knows you talked." Caleb looked up sharply. "What'd she say?" "Nothing to me." Kessler paused. "But she doesn't think talking makes you brave." "She's right." Kessler nodded once and moved on. That evening at Ellen's house, the visitors finally thinned enough for the rooms to feel inhabited instead of occupied. The dishwasher ran. The trash cans were full of paper plates and sympathy cards. Flower arrangements crowded the dining table and made the place smell like an overwatered chapel. Lena sat at the kitchen table in silence, while Sarah sorted envelopes from the funeral home, writing names into a notebook for thank you cards nobody yet had the strength to imagine sending. Ellen stood at the stove, reheating soup because routine was the closest thing to medicine she knew. Emmy colored at the far end of the table with a purple crayon and asked every 20 minutes when Daddy was coming home. Each time, one of the adults answered with a new version of the same impossible sentence. After Emmy was finally asleep again, Lena pushed the notebook away from Sarah. "Stop." Sarah blinked. "What?" "Stop writing names. I can hear your pen scratching from 3 rooms away." Sarah stared at the page. "If I don't do something, I'm gonna come apart." "Then come apart." Lena's voice wasn't sharp, just tired. "This house is full of women pretending structure will save them." Ellen set down the soup ladle and turned. "Sometimes it helps." "Does it?" Lena looked at both of them. "Because right now, all I can think about is that Daniel got up yesterday, kissed me, made a joke about being late, and by dinner time I was identifying his body in a ditch. So somebody explain to me what list or casserole or prayer chain is supposed to fix the distance between those two facts." Silence filled the kitchen. Sarah looked down because she had no answer and hated being the sort of person who kept reaching for one anyway. Ellen crossed the room slowly and sat beside Lena. "Nothing fixes it," she said. "That's the hard bargain. We do these little things because they are too small to solve anything, and too necessary to skip." Lena turned her face away, eyes filling. I don't want necessary. I want impossible. Ellen touched the back of her hand. I know. Lena finally cried then. Not with the violence of the first night, or the stunned gasping of the road, but with the deep, exhausted grief of a person whose body can no longer carry the weight upright. Sarah moved beside her without thinking, and the three women sat clustered at the kitchen table under the yellow light, while Lena wept into both hands, and the soup cooled on the stove. There was no dramatic revelation in it, no sudden healing, just shared endurance. Sometimes that was all family could honestly offer. The next morning brought the arraignment, and with it, television cameras on the courthouse lawn, men in polos from Little Rock talking into microphones, and local people pretending they had errands downtown so they could hover near the steps. Ashford County Courthouse had seen bootleggers, divorces, and election fraud hearings. It had never seen this many satellite dishes. Caleb was brought in through a side entrance in County Orange, and shackles at wrists and ankles. The chain between his hands clinked softly as the bailiff led him down the hall. He kept his eyes on the worn tile because every face he glanced at seemed to hold a claim on him. In the courtroom, the benches were full. Lena sat in the front row between Sarah and Ellen, black blazer on, jaw set, Daniel's wedding band hanging from a chain beneath her blouse, where no one could see it, but she could feel the weight. Bledsoe sat on the aisle. Kessler stood near the back with the prosecutor. When Caleb entered, a low murmur moved through the room like wind through dry grass. He looked thinner already, or maybe grief made everyone appear reduced. He lifted his eyes once and found Lena. He had told himself he would not seek her out. He did anyway. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second, then turned away as if he were less than a stranger. That hurt more than hatred would have. The hearing itself was procedural and cold. Charges were read. Counsel appointed. Dates set. The prosecutor emphasized the seriousness of the offense, and Caleb's cooperation in the related criminal investigation. Speaking in the same tone a person might use to discuss weather patterns and property tax disputes. Caleb answered yes, sir, and no, sir, when required. He entered no plea yet. The judge, an older woman with rimless glasses and no patience for spectacle, ordered him held without bond. At one point she looked over the file and said, "The court recognizes the additional harm caused by the familial relationship between the defendant and the deceased." The sentence was legally accurate and emotionally obscene. Lena felt Sarah go rigid beside her. Familial relationship. As if there were a phrase in the English language antiseptic enough to cover what Caleb had done. When it was over and the bailiff moved to lead Caleb out, he stopped, not because anyone invited him to speak, but because some impulse stronger than self-preservation reached the surface. He turned slightly toward the bench. "Your Honor." His attorney hissed his name, but Caleb kept going. "I know this isn't the time." The judge stared at him over her glasses. "No, it is not." Caleb swallowed. His voice shook anyway. "I just need the record to show Daniel Rourke didn't die because he was careless. He died because I was a coward." The courtroom went still. His attorney looked sick. The prosecutor stiffened. The judge's expression did not change, but her silence allowed the words to land. Caleb's gaze shifted then, not to Lena or Sarah this time, but somewhere lower, somewhere no one could meet him from. He was doing his job. He was trying to help me even then. "I want that," said Plain. The judge held his stare for a long moment, then said, "Mr. Mercer, whatever else happens in these proceedings, the facts will be established by evidence, not speeches. But the court has heard you." She nodded to the bailiff. "Take him." Caleb did not resist. He let the chain lead him out. Behind him, the room remained silent until the side door closed. Outside on the courthouse steps, cameras shouted, questions the instant Lena emerged. "Missus Rourke, do you forgive him? Do you think cooperation should reduce his sentence? Did Daniel know about the corruption case?" Sheriff's deputies pushed a path, but Lena stopped halfway down the steps and turned. The microphones lifted toward her, like a cluster of mechanical flowers. Sarah caught her breath, thinking for one terrified second that Lena might break. Instead, Lena looked straight into the cameras with a face carved clean by loss. "My husband was a good man," she said, her voice carried without needing force. "He loved his family, and he took his oath seriously. Whatever happens to the people who used him, lied to him, or killed him, do not let that become the bigger story. The bigger story is that he lived well." She paused, the sunlight hard on her face. "And for the people asking whether I forgive anybody, today is Thursday. He was buried yesterday. You can live without that answer." Then she turned and walked to the waiting car, leaving the reporters with nothing but the truth and their own embarrassment. Sarah got in beside her and shut the door against the shouts outside. For a moment neither spoke. Then Sarah let out a shaky breath that was almost admiration. Daniel would have loved that. Lena looked straight ahead. I hope so. Back at the jail later that afternoon, Caleb was returned to his cell, with the courthouse still echoing inside him. His lawyer had called him reckless. Kessler had called his statement unhelpful to strategy. Bledsoe, passing in the corridor, had simply looked at him with an expression too complicated to name. Caleb sat on the bunk and listened to the place settle around him again. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed at a television. Somewhere else, a man cursed over a card game. Life, indifferent as always, kept moving beside his ruin. He thought about Lena on the courthouse steps. He had not heard her words, but he could picture the set of her shoulders, the refusal to give strangers what they wanted. Daniel had loved that about her. She was flint when necessary. Sarah, too. Ellen had made flint of both daughters by sheer example. Caleb looked at his own hands, resting open on his knees. They seemed less like his every day. Not in a mystical sense. In the plain way that guilt estranges a person from his own ordinary movements. Through the small window, late afternoon light slanted across the wall. He realized with surprising clarity that he did not want death anymore. Not because he felt hopeful, and not because he imagined redemption waiting if he behaved well. He did not want death because it would end the only honest thing still available to him, which was living long enough to remain responsible. The recognition was not noble. It was grim, but it was clean. That evening, Lena stood alone on the back porch of her house while Sarah put Emmy to bed inside. She had insisted on coming home for a few hours, insisted on opening windows, folding Daniel's jacket, standing in rooms that still smelled like him until the smell became memory instead of ambush. The porch looked out on a narrow yard and a chain-link fence Daniel had promised to replace before winter. Cicadas screamed from the trees. The air held that heavy southern softness that made every sound seem farther away than it was. Lena wrapped her arms around herself and stared at the dark yard. She was not better, not close. The pain had not transformed into wisdom or purpose. It was still a jagged thing with edges sharp enough to catch on every ordinary object in the house. But beneath it, almost too faint to trust, another feeling had begun. Not peace. Never that. Something more stubborn. Continuance, maybe. The knowledge that the next morning would come whether she approved or not. And Emmy would need cereal, and the bills would still arrive. And Daniel's truck would still need deciding over, and his absence would have to be carried not as an event, but as weather. Sarah stepped onto the porch quietly and stood beside her. For a while they said nothing. Then Sarah asked, "Do you ever think you'll forgive me for being related to him?" Lena closed her eyes. "That isn't a fair question." "Probably not." Sarah shoved her hands into her pockets. "Still think it." Lena turned to look at her. In the porch light, Sarah's face showed every sleepless hour of the week. "I don't blame you for his blood," Lena said. "I blame you for all the years you spent trying to save him in ways that taught him someone would always come after." Sarah took that in without flinching, because she had already said the same thing to herself in harsher language. "That's fair," she said. Lena looked back out at the yard. "And I also know Daniel loved you. So if I cut you loose completely, I'd be amputating one more thing he cared about." Sarah's eyes filled. "That sounds uncomfortable." "It does," Lena exhaled. "Most true things do." Sarah gave a broken little laugh. Then, carefully, as if approaching a wild animal, she reached out and took Lena's hand. Lena let her. They stood that way a long time. Two women bound by a man they had both lost, and another man they had both lost differently. Inside the house, Emmy called sleepily for water. Sarah squeezed Lena's hand once and went back in. Lena stayed on the porch another minute, listening to the familiar rooms shift around unfamiliar damage. Then she turned and followed her inside, because grief was still there, and would be there tomorrow. But so was the child, so was the house, so was the unfinished life Daniel had left in their care. Across town, in a cell that smelled of bleach and metal, Caleb lay awake and stared into the dark, hearing none of this, entitled to none of it, but knowing with a cold steadiness that the days ahead would keep arriving anyway, and that this, more than any verdict, would be the shape of his punishment. Not one moment of ruin, but a lifetime of living after the shot, while the people he loved learned how to do the same without him.